A very warm and good afternoon to all of you. We are very pleased to have amongst us Professor Daya Thussu for our fourth lecture series of the Department of Culture and Media Studies, Central University of Rajasthan. Professor Thussu is a renowned professor in the field of international communication, and currently he is at the Department of Journalism, Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor Thussu was a visiting professor and inaugural Disney Chair in Global Media at Swajman College in Beijing. For many years, he was Professor of International Communication and co-director of India Media Center, as well as research advisor to the China Media Center at the University of Westminster in London. With a PhD in International Relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, he worked as a journalist both in India and the UK for the Press Trust of India, the country's national news agency, and at the Gemini News Service as associate editor. He is the founder and managing editor of the Sage Journal Global Media and Communication, and is the author and editor of 18 books. And we really look forward to his talk today on the topic India in the Global Newsphere. And sir, we are really very much happy to that it is because of this situation we are able to see so many great faces online meeting together in a common platform to hear you. And sir, over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Just a correction. My latest count is now 20 books. I've done 2 more since that. I don't know where you got that detail from.
Congratulations. Thank you, sir.
So I wanted to just start by thanking Professor Dhulia for giving me this opportunity to talk to you and his team. It's one of the perhaps the only good thing which has come out of this dreadful virus is that it has in some ways democratized conversation and academia. Ordinarily, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for me to be in Ajmer in the middle of an academic term. But by being on, it's not Zoom, but one of those platforms for 2 hours, you can actually talk to people across the globe, and I do that quite a lot. I was saying earlier before we started that it's kind of a Zoom fatigue setting in now. Because as some of you were saying already, we've been teaching on Zoom, and we had the kind of mixed mode teaching, and that is itself quite a challenge, both sort of pedagogically. How do you we've been teaching in classroom face to face for such a long time, and now it's very hard to kind of negotiate between the screen, and because we have some people in the classroom, some are not, so it's quite an interesting experience. So I'm really very pleased to be able to speak to you. My topic today is something which is very close to my research interests. Those of you who know my work, I've been working on international aspects of media and communication for now, I don't know how many years, quite a long time. And my publications, my research is really within that field, and that has been a fabulous experience because I'm from India. I lived in UK for many years, 30 years in fact, and now for last 2.5 years I've been in this part of the world, and that itself is amazing experience if you're interested in international affairs, international communication, global communication, etc., because these are quite different experiences. When you look at the world from Beijing, it's a very different world. When you look at the world from London, they still think they rule the world, although the world has changed, right? So it's a very different narrative, different discourse. And coming from India, which always has had its own narrative, whether people take it seriously outside India or not, but it has always had its own narrative. And in today's talk, what I wanted to really discuss is, why is that the Indian voice is not that strong in the international news, especially news media? We're pretty big in entertainment, but why is it that in the news sphere, where we have probably, despite what's happening to media in recent years, perhaps the most sophisticated media systems anywhere on the planet. We have the advantage of English language. We have the advantage of a democratic system where debates are accepted, of course, within limits. But we have not yet become a global player, and then I want to explore why that is the case. But before I do that, I want to also set it up in terms of what is the structure like? What is the international news media structure like? Where do we fit into that? And then I want to end with some reflections about whether the amazing growth of the digital media and the growth of internet may allow us some space to uh, project a kind of Indian narrative. If television has not really, or print media hasn't done that, let's hope that internet might do that. Let me hold on. I was okay. Are you going to do this, or I was going to do it myself? It might be easier, so I know when to. Should I try doing it here? Should I do it here and see if I can present it here? Um,
Okay, sir.
okay, let me try because I'm not so used to this. Um, I'm used to. So where do I go? Entire screen? No.
No, no, window.
Okay, hold on. So please apologize. My apologies in advance. So window, and then where do I go? Share?
Yeah, window, the PPT would be coming.
No, but it's not. Why is it not coming? So shall I
Okay,
open?
open the PPT and do not minimize it. Just
Okay,
go to
it's
the tab.
open. Okay,
Yeah,
and can
go
you
to
see
the
it now? No, you can't see it. Can
no,
you
no,
see it?
no, 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 sir.
Okay, all right. So, it's here.
Now we have to go to present now and then.
Can
Yes,
you
sir.
see?
Yes, yes, sir. Now it's visible.
Can you see it? Okay.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
All
yes,
right.
that's
Excellent.
fine.
Okay. Excellent. Good. So, there's my email there. So, if we don't have enough time for discussion, please feel free to contact me via email. I'm still not a social media person, so my communication is still through email. Um, so, as I said, let's sort of start with what is the global media space like, and why does it matter? So, we people like us who are in academia, who kind of travel, I mean, I've been very fortunate because I taught in a place like London, where you have students from all over the world, and faculty from all over the world. So you get to know, about other cultures, about other narratives, through students and through colleagues or through other networks. Um, but for most people, they are getting their information about the world at large through mass media. Um, and I must also emphasize, in today's talk, my focus is on international media. I'm not talking about domestic media at all. Um, so it has been suggested that media are central to both globalization processes and for intercultural communication, as source of information as well as understanding of other cultures. Because most of us do not really have direct experience of other cultures, and our understanding is often affected by what we see. Mostly visual media are very, very important, and if media are important, then who is providing those pictures and those images? So there is the kind of dominant media flows, mainly US based, although UK is an important player too. But there's also an increasing uh, amount of content coming out of non-Western world. Here's some examples, as you see, whether it's our cinema or it's Al Jazeera network in the Arab world, or Japanese animation, Brazilian telenovelas, Korean popular music, Turkish television, etc., etc. Um, it is small in comparison to the US-dominated media system, but it is growing, and that makes the global media space much more interesting. Um, More recently, in the last 2 decades, the whole digitization process and mechanisms of new deliveries has revolutionized the amount of content that now travels across globally instantaneously, and has an impact on how people perceive any aspect of any subject, really, because now you have the concept of viral news, and you have social media, and you have all kinds of information competing for attention. And we're living in a networked society. It is a globally networked society today, and it is a globally mobile networked society. So the traditional kind of approach in which one has understood global media system is undergoing a lot of change, and is primarily driven by technology. Having said that, the old structures have not disappeared. In fact, one could argue that they have come back onto the scene with greater rigor and effectiveness. So, for an example, if you think of Britain, or think of London as a city, as a media center, a global media center, even today it remains an extremely important, uh, you know, locus for international media. Although Britain's position as a global power has diminished substantially, and after Brexit it will diminish further, but its role in kind of setting the media agenda, especially news agenda, is still very important. And then, therefore, one has to go back a little bit in history. This recent publication, well, not that recent now, but 9 years ago, um, about the BBC. And if you think of why BBC is important today in 2021, you have to go back to the 1920s and see how integral it was to the whole imperial project. As this study says, it was engaged in broadcasting to and about the empire and building up a broadcasting empire of its own. Um, and despite the relatively less important role that UK has in global affairs, BBC still remains arguably the most influential television broadcaster and radio broadcaster in the world. Um, Also important in terms of news media are the news agencies, which provide the basic information about international affairs. And again, the Western domination, especially Anglo-American domination, is well documented. So you have Thomson Reuters, you have Associated Press, and you have Agence France Presse, basically three um, news um, agencies which account for more than 80% of international news. Um, and all of these are, you know, been there for 150 years. Actually, AFP was previously Havas, which was set up in 1840s, and Reuters 1850s. So they've been there for a long time, and they have, over a period of time, developed a certain credibility, certain professionalism. So if there is a Reuters news agency report, it is very likely that it will be factually correct. Although there have been cases where there is factual inaccuracy, but even if there is, they will immediately send a correction, because that's how they operate. And as a professional organization, has been there for 100 years, 2+ years, 150 years. Um, Although there might be issues about contextual accuracy, so context may be, skewed or you know organized in a particular manner, and that can be a problem for many countries, um, including India. So these are, like, if you like, the first draft of journalism, global journalism, and therefore first draft of history. If you look at, for example, business journalism, which is extremely important in this age of digital capitalism, um, the most important publication is the Wall Street Journal. Um, you know, as you know, has an Asia edition, Europe edition, etc. Huge public circulation, as well as the fact that it is Mr. Murdoch's owned by Mr. Murdoch, which people sometimes forget. It is probably the most powerful media outlet that Mr. Murdoch's news corporation still holds. Um, in terms of news magazines, again, Time magazine, despite now in this age of multimedia and digital world, doesn't have as much influence as it used to, but it actually redefined journalism. It was only set up in 1920s, 1923 to be precise. Huge circulation, different editions, and sorry, and it's still, if you get on the cover of Time magazine, you have made it. We had that grandmother from Delhi who made it to the Time magazine, and a lot of stories about the fact that she made it to the Time magazine cover. Um, and it's still hugely influential in terms of setting the agenda of international news. Um, its rival, Newsweek, is been revived, but doesn't have the same status. And then you have the British Voice, The Economist, which is even older, huge circulation. This is the print one. The digital copies are even big, numbers are even bigger. What is interesting about it that it is actually only major publication that I know which has more readers outside the country of its origin. So 80% are outside the UK, and out of those, half of them are in the United States. So the American elite likes reading The Economist. And this typically British magazine is actually now owned by an Italian family. It used to be part of a very British company, but for very long time. Um, and its influence, again, I don't need to emphasize to this audience. I'll just say that not long ago, late Mr. Jaitley was, when he was finance minister, he was waving a copy of The Economist in the Lok Sabha to say, look, Economist is saying this about us. I'm yet to see a British Chancellor of Exchequer showing copy of India Today or Outlook or Frontline, say, look, this is what the Indians are saying about our budget or our economy. Now these are well established, and they've been doing this for a very long time, 100 years plus, and we're talking about elite media, which still has a relatively small audience. You have to be educated to a certain level to actually able to read the Economist magazine, because its prose is famously, interesting. They write beautifully, um, and and you have to have a certain understanding of the world affairs to read it, to understand it, to enjoy it. Um, Television changes all that because visuals have a different um, audience. You don't need that kind of literacy. So what's happening in the television news space? Where is that leading us to? Let me just go briefly to that. So in the last two, maybe quarter century now, actually, there has been a very important shift in broadcasting around the world. The whole idea of deregulation, privatization, etc., which has happened, with possible exception of North Korea. Um, everywhere in the world, even in China, where there is a very strong private, advertisement-driven media, especially in regional television, not in so much in the news area, but certainly in television as an industry. And increasingly, you see a American model, which is advertisement-based commercial model, and as against the public service tradition, which was and still is pretty, strong in parts of Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, but much of the world, it is the commercial model, which is essentially based on ratings, and you know, um, so only certain kinds of news items get broadcast because they have um, good kind of popular audience. Um, Even in this space, in terms of talking about international news and international television news, the big players are still really English-speaking countries. US, CNN actually created this whole idea of 24/7 news. BBC World Service is, of course, World News, sorry, very important television network. And Sky News, which is not that big globally speaking, because it's big in the UK, it's available in Europe, but it also has an Arabic service. And when you connect it with Fox News in the US, which was, they were together until recently, only recently Fox got separated from Sky News, it just becomes then quite an important player internationally, and much more tabloidy than the first two. Even in terms of television news footage, because television is an expensive medium, and most networks around the world do not have the resources or technology to able to get access to material. And again, that material is provided by basically two news agencies, television news agencies. One is APTN, Associated Press Television News, which is part of AP, I mentioned earlier, and Reuters Television, which is part of Reuters. Um, so it's not surprising that, if you look at news feed on international news, these are identical footage because it's been provided by the same agency. And again, this gives them a huge amount of power in terms of setting the agenda. I'll speak about that in a minute more. Um, Even in the digital journalism space, which is supposed to be more democratic and less dominant in that sense, more like up, bottoms up kind of thing. The big players, really, without exception, are American companies. They have local operations, as you probably know now. Huffington Post and BuzzFeed have, merged, and um, but you will have a version of BuzzFeed in Europe, in India. I know they're still going, but they used to have one in India also. And you can connect a lot of these to either Europe or North America, and you know, with few exceptions, mostly we're talking about the United States, not Canada. So that's the reality of global news system. It is a system which was set up in the 19th century, and even today, in the third decade of the 21st century, still remains very well embedded. Um, One British sociologist, Jeremy Tunstall, uses the phrase news duopoly, US UK news duopoly, to describe this phenomenon, because he says not monopoly, because UK still remains an important player, particularly in relation to BBC or Reuters or Economist or The Guardian or Times, etc. So if you look at this chart, you have various types of media, whether it's social media or television news or news magazine or business press or New York Times, or international radio, BBC Radio, Voice of America. A very strong US UK imprint on international news is to be seen. And this is well rehearsed. There's a lot of stuff written on it. I've written a lot of stuff on it myself, but there's a lot of work already being done. Some people call it media imperialism. All kinds of nomenclature is used to describe the phenomena, but the phenomena exists. And it is, in fact, with the digitization, now New York Times has something like 7 million subscribers. And it's astonishing. In the last 10 years, they've done phenomenally well, and they're being read by many, many more people than was the case um, even a decade ago. So why does it matter? Um, this is nothing new. You might say with digitization, their imprint has become more uh, wider and bigger, but fundamentally, it's nothing new. And why does it matter? Basically, two words, in my view, summarize the problem. And these are dominance and dependence. There is a well established, well documented dominance of Anglo American media on international news narratives. And most of the world is dependent on this because, as I tried to explain in a very cursory way, even if you look at different genres of media, the big players are mostly Americans and a bit Britain. That's not to say that the Germans are not important, but I'll mention that also in a minute. But the big core, the core is Anglo-American. Um, so why does it matter? Anglo-American news has the capacity to set the global news agenda. Now, on any given day, millions of things happen around the world. Somebody decides that we're going to pick 20 stories out of it and make that information into news. That's a professional job. They get paid to do this, and they have been doing it for a very long time. But there is a certain, element of um, although they would dispute it that it's an objective, etc., but they have the capacity to decide these are the top 10 stories or top 20 stories in a given day. And more often than not, these are the stories which have an interest in the dominant narrative and how they fit into that narrative. Now, these are not new debates, and some of the older colleagues who are in this session would remember, in the 70s, there was a big discussion, very heated debates within UNESCO about the so-called New World Information Order. And the debate was about distortions and imbalances, and these are the words which were used. Dependence was widely used in that time. And the idea was that the what was then called the third world gets very bad press because it only gets certain kind of stories covered. Um, now, the problem is that it's not just about what gets left out; it's also about what areas get left out. So, the whole idea of geopolitics of news. Now, this is something very close to my current research interest. I'm writing a book about calling it Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication. It's a single author book, it's a lot of work, but I have no um, excuse not to work because I've been given relatively light teaching load this semester to finish the book. But anyway, so if you think of, for example, conflicts, wars, when the West is involved in a conflict, for example, Iraq, for example, Syria, Libya, more recent examples, you get wall-to-wall coverage. But certain wars where West has a kind of indirect interest, neighborhood, Sri Lankan civil war would be a good case in point. Didn't fit in the global geopolitics, so it doesn't get as much coverage. Where I live now, Hong Kong, is an interesting case again, and I'm writing something about that in this book. The anti-government protests got wall-to-wall coverage in Western media. Thankfully, only one person died in those protests in 2019. I was here, and I saw it. Not the death, but and he died of an accident. In the same period, there were many, many more violent anti-government demonstrations around the world, including in Baghdad, where 100 people died. They didn't make the headline. Not only headline, they didn't make whole narrative discourse. So deeply geopolitical in that sense. Um, and the capacity to shape the global public opinion, the global public sphere, the space within which uh, public opinion is formed, and that is extraordinary power that this media kind of convergence the US UK has given it, and it has exercised it extremely cleverly, and I would argue so far successfully. But there is also much more awareness today because we are living in a more complex media ecology. Technology has, you know, democratized communication. There is a lot more connectivity than was the case when these debates were very big in the 70s, etc. Um, so just sticking with news and sticking with television news, today you have an increasing amount of content coming out of non-Western or not a non-Anglo-American world. Um, I did a book some years ago, 2007, so 14 years ago. It was called the Contraflow in Global Media. Um, Flow and Contraflow it was called. And I mean, since then it's become bigger. So here are some examples of major countries which have their news networks in English to speak to the world. So you have RT, Russia, TRT World, which is Turkish, I-24, which is Israeli, CGTN, the Chinese one, NDTV, you all know. I mentioned NDTV there because that's the oldest Indian international network, although it's very small in comparison to others. And it's the only one in the list which is actually not controlled by the government. All others, whether it's a Deutsche Welle or Press TV, which is Iranian, France 24, French, Deutsche News is obviously German, um, are essentially funded by the state. And given the way the news economics work, if they were, the governments decided to, pull back their money, they will collapse in a couple of weeks. Because even more professional ones like Al Jazeera, they would not have enough audience to justify the kind of resources that they need to operate as a global um, international news operation. I mean, um, if you think of the ones I mentioned earlier, whether it is CNN or BBC, they are major media conglomerates. So BBC made something like £1 billion 2 years ago. That's the latest data I had in my recent book. Maybe it's more now, maybe less because of COVID. But by just selling programs, formats, etc., £1 billion, right? So it's a lot of money, and it also gets indirect support from the state, and I'm sure CNN does too. Where are we in this? Um, NDTV is not even marginal, really. But where is Doordarshan, which is the second biggest terrestrial television network in the world? Satellite TV came to India 10 years before it arrived in Europe. It was Mrs. Gandhi's project, remember Asiad, and she said what she very openly said that I don't own newspapers, so I need to own television, and she did. Um, More recently, some of you would know, the government of India set up a little committee of few ministers and some friendly journalists um, to talk about you know government communication, which is fascinating. It was something very close to my research interest. As some of you probably know, I have a PhD in international relations, so I'm in that sense, quite an oddity in communication field, because I don't do communication. I do international relations from a communication perspective. So I was very excited that they were thinking about it. And there is, I saw the document. It's available publicly, although it's not officially released. But in this digital age, everything is possible. It has a section 6.3, which is titled "Projecting India Abroad." This was only last December, right? And they talk about DD International and talk about AIR World. And the words they use is strong international presence would also help to project India's image abroad and to counter false narratives. Um, so, you know, they're talking about it. I don't know how they will implement it, but the past record is not very encouraging, because India is the only major country in the world whose voice in international news space is negligible. Which is, probably we can discuss it, in more detail later. But it's interesting that that is the case. Um, so these are government ones, apart from the TV, and they are not operating in a commercial environment. So for them, they are in various degrees propaganda outfits for their respective governments. CGTN, probably the most obvious case because it's Chinese. RT, less so, but still, it's Mr. Putin's channel. And Al Jazeera is, as I said before, perhaps most professional of these, but it has been used by Qatari government to promote its own soft power, if you like. But the world with media world within which they are operating is actually grossly commercial and becoming more and more commercial at a time when television is not something that young people watch. Television news is certainly something which young people do not watch around the world. And therefore, there's a tendency to make news more entertaining, and there's a tendency to pick up stories which translate into more, ratings or clicks or whatever. Um, Let's also remember the Western media. If you look at the history of major media organizations, that from its very inception, journalism also has been a business. So commerce is extremely important aspect of that. Um, Many years ago, maybe 2006 or seven, I can't remember now. I did a book. It was called "News as Entertainment," and the subtitle was "Rise of Global Infotainment." And I looked at television news around the world. It's probably the first study which did that in a kind of global context. And I found that, in Europe, for example, there was a very clear shift from this public service tradition to commercial advertisement-driven television news. Even in the UK, which is supposed to be, the BBC territory, even there, the audience for public service broadcasting was declining. Some people have even declared that public service is dead, although, as COVID has shown, it is alive and well. Um, Even in former Soviet Union or China or much of Eastern Europe, there was a very clear ideological shift from this whole socialist tradition of public media to private market-led media, much more in Russia than in China. But even in China, people outside sometimes do not appreciate it. Marketization is fundamental. Advertising is fundamental. And it's the same logic as you would see in Western countries. Apart from the news arena is less so, because news is still very much controlled by a one-party state. In our own country, I use the phrase Bollywoodization. There's a whole chapter in the book about India. And this was 2006, so it must be written in 2005. And I sort of looking at it now in 2021, I thought, okay, probably I was right, because that's exactly what has happened. in a country where until 1991 we had a state monopoly, one channel in a country of that size and diversity, and now we have 400 plus and counting. Now, I don't know how many of these are actually news channels or but they claim to be. Anyway, um, so Bollywood is big. Bollywood is big not just in India, obviously, although I don't like the phrase Bollywood, but because it's now used globally, so I'm also using it with qualification. Um, that's where India is known in the media space. Outside India, people have some idea of this odd cinema where people, melodramatic cinema where people have, you know, exaggerated emotions and, rather simple storyline, etc., etc. Although I'm caricaturing, it's much more complicated, and India has more than just Bollywood. Um, there are all those Tollywood and Gollywood, all those regional variations. But what you see globally is a certain um, you know presence of Indian in popular cinema around the world, whether it's in Russia, which was very big in the 50s, or the Arab world, this is from Egypt, or more recently in China, where Uncle Amir is extremely popular even today, despite recent trouble. Um, So Bollywood is there both nationally very important phenomena and globally as a marker of certain kind of cinema, which is not Hollywood, which is has its own idiosyncrasies, but is rooted in a certain culture. You really cannot think of many other countries where they have that kind of distinct cinema. You may like it or not, but that's a different discussion. But how this Bollywoodized entertainment has gone into news media is something really interesting. And we've seen that more in all its glory last year when we had the Sushant Singh case. And it was, I don't need to, you know, labor this point, you know what I'm going to say, but it just took over airwaves for weeks on end as if nothing else was happening in a country which has so many pressing issues. There was border conflict, there was COVID, there were all kinds of very serious existential things happening in the country. And the discussion on television was about whether this young woman had taken drugs or not, or whether this guy, I don't know, you know the story. But that took over the airwaves. And we're talking about national channels. We're talking about English language channels, which is supposed to be for an elite audience. Um, so when you think of that and think about how would that be taken seriously by outside world? How could a country which is this incredibly rich tradition of journalism, Times of India was set up in 1835. There are like 10 generations of people who write in English, understand English. We are good at it, and we have a tradition of debate and discussion, and it's as plural as it gets. So many languages, so many cultures. Um, why are we not interested in the wider world? What we have instead is this. All this. I don't want to again, just to kind of remind you. This was again, it dominated headlines for. One of the great things living outside is even and with the internet you can access these things. So I do watch them for work, and it's fascinating to see. And again, these are national channels. We're talking about News 18, which is owned by the richest man in the country, probably the most powerful individual in India after Mr. Modi. And so it's not some kind of extreme, marginal. This is national television. Um, and then you have this debate, and there are several debates. And as you can count here, 3, 3, 6, 9, and 9 and 6 is 15 faces. Of course, the anchor speaks for 45 minutes out of an hour. And that's itself a record. I studied these things internationally. I can't think of another network which has that distinction. And when you meet Mr. Goswami privately, he's a very polite and decent guy and highly intelligent guy. But there's a persona on television. And what worries me is that we get so carried away by these fake debates that we lose any serious, meaningful discussion about what is needed for a country of our size and complexity. And if you have to articulate that position, then you have to tell the world about that particular position. At the moment, what we're doing is there's those debates that you see 15 people shouting at each other in a language which I find alien. I grew up in India. I did my PhD in Delhi. I have still an Indian passport, and I feel very Indian. I feel offended by the kind of languages um, and words people use on prime time television. So something is it's not only debases the language and our wonderful Sanatani culture, but actually it is an affront to journalism, to public journalism particularly. So what happens as a result is that our achievements are not noticed internationally. So we had one of the largest vaccination programs in the world. Now, if you remember when there was this, when vaccination started in UK, that was the global story. Everybody had the picture of that old lady who got injected, and it was, because they control that. They control the narrative. Um, we don't have that. We do it nationally, people know it, but internationally, unless there is a company which is interested in producing something in India, so they might do a little story about, Serum Institute, but they do not understand the complexity of a country as big as and as diverse as India, which was able to produce not one but two vaccines, one of them Indian vaccine, within a span of 1 year. It's an astonishing achievement. But show me an article in New York Times or The Economist or BBC which actually extols this. I can show you dozens of articles where they talk about how wonderful Oxford Zeneca is. We also do not have the capacity to rebut. So there was a piece with the Times of London ran um, in November. China turns Ladakh battleground with India into a microwave oven. And it was picked up by the Australian because it's Anglo-American connection. It became a global story. It was based on very, very malicious and wrong information. So what we had to do, we had PIB fact check. We had to do this. This is a fake news, right? Internationally, there's nobody who's talking about it on India's behalf because we don't have that voice. We are in studio talking about a particular election or a particular individual. Um, More recently, we have this. Of course, again, I don't want to, and the case. That's the response, which gets international coverage because this girl is a media creation, right? Think about it. How did she get to that position? How did she goes to UN and lectures? People meets those big politicians. What credentials does she have? And think of what the capacity of this media system is to create somebody from nowhere. What we do instead is this. So because we don't do things properly, we're famous for that, right? We do half-heartedly. We're not professional. We have all the capacity, but we don't do it properly. So they put the Pakistani flag in Rihanna's hands. Somebody found out the actual picture was different, right? So we do things ham-handedly because there's no system in place which says, okay, we need to have a narrative which has to professionally done because we're not lying, we're not creating propaganda, we're just stating facts as they are. So if television has not really succeeded, will the internet make a difference? Because everything is moving in that domain anyway. We're getting into the digital world. And the examples that you're looking at now are essentially, it's a Twitter account or some kind of social media, and this. So that's the kind of norm. So where does India fit in that? Um, this whole Digital India project with Mr. Modi has very enthusiastically, in my view, absolutely sensibly promoted. It should have been done 20 years ago, but now it's being done. That's fantastic. And just imagine what would have happened if COVID had hit us and we didn't have an Aadhaar system, or we didn't have a JAM system, Jan Dhan Yojana, mobile and Aadhaar connection, which Arvind Subramanian set up. How many more people would have suffered? Right? And the whole communication structure would have been so much more difficult. So, what's happening to internet now? This is a data from last year, actually January last year. So things change very, very rapidly in this domain. So number of users in millions. China obviously top, India, US, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, Japan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Now, interesting figure is the people who are not online as of last year. So US only 4%, Japan 10%, India 40, maybe it's now 42%, 43%, whatever. It's now nearly 800 million. China has crossed a billion now. So growth is going to come from these countries, obviously. And unlike China and many other countries, India has a huge demographic advantage because we have a young population and a population which is very much into digital life, because they are digital natives, and there is an extraordinary amount of expertise and talent which half decent government would use, which more often than not it doesn't. Um, and then there are very interesting shifts happening within the corporate world, and a very important convergence between, if you like, digital capitalism and a government which is unabashedly pro-business. Um, so, internationally, Modi's government and BJP gets a lot of flack for communalism, nationalism, Hindutva, it's call it what you like. But actually, the most significant changes, the structural changes that are happening, apart from business press, because business press has a different kind of leadership, by and large, that story of India doesn't get international experience. So just think of Geo, for instance. It's only 4 years old, 5 years old, and already it is operating in so many different domains. Um, and with the 5G coming in the next year or so, and Geo is going to get very, very important. It's very big in television. It's hugely important on internet, but also e-commerce, etc., etc. So even the well-established actors like Amazon and Alibaba, it's not quite there yet, but already within a very short span of time, it has done, in my view, extremely uh, well. And there is also a lot of potential for further growth, because there is this interesting convergence between um, a very proactive government and the demographics, as well as the business savviness of this particular company. In terms of journalism, also there has been this is a study done in Reuters Institute at Oxford. A lot of um, digital kind of journalism, online journalism, are people getting their information through social media. WhatsApp, as you see here, is 52%. Of course, these are surveys or interviews of the selected people. So you don't take them literally, but it gives you a sense of the trend, and the trend is unmistakable and not particularly specific to India. The point for India is that the scale and the scope of change is so profound that it has impact internationally. And only comparison that we should be thinking about is with China. Um, but unlike India, China has its own internet. It is its own platforms, its own Google, its own Facebook, its own Twitter. And the outside world has been Western world, that is US particularly, because all these companies that you look on your screen, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., they are all American companies, right? And they control a lot of global data, except in China. So if China is doing something which is indigenous, the whole idea of cyber sovereignty, um, they are. So the debate has been about censorship and control, and it's all very valid. But precisely, and I've argued in a book I published a couple of years ago, that precisely because it is controlled, that they were able to develop their own. They didn't have to compete with the Google or Facebook. No other country in the world has managed that. No Germany, no Britain, no France. These are sophisticated countries with resources and educated population, etc., infrastructure, everything. They're quite happy to use American platforms. To a certain extent, Russia has done it, but not in the way that China has. And now some of these platforms are going global. So that's the big digital debate and the discussion, which is so-called Cold War 2.0. I think we are waking up to this at last, it seems to me. So this idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, but digitally Atmanirbhar Bharat, is interesting. And already, they've launched an Indian version of Twitter. It's called Coup. Apparently, I mean, I'm not on Twitter, so I don't know how good or bad it is. But I hear from friends that it's not very good because, as most things, we do things without thinking through, without planning, without organizing. Only country in the world where we, anyway, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe in the discussion talk about that. But there's also this plan of messaging service, Sandesh, which is in the beta stage, but hopefully it will be emerging. And I think the fact that there is a lot of discussion about this and a serious intent, at least, to develop Indian platforms, and India has all the expertise that it needs. It has a huge market, and the market is going to grow. I do think that it is, belated but very significant intervention by the state, and state has to take that role, and in conjunction with industry, because you cannot in China, even which is supposed to be one party state, if you look at the involvement of private capital, whether it's foreign capital or domestic capital, is huge. So let me just then few more like two more slides, and I'll stop in time for more discussion. um, so, where are we in the global media sphere? As the digital space becomes more important, there will be growing presence of content coming out of non-traditional sources, whether they are citizen journalists, whether they are IT cell of a political party, or they are influencers of an organization, or they are paid, they're bots, they're machines. The question then is, will it are these complementing or undermining traditional journalism? And especially in the international context, where there's a lot of this, WhatsApp university type material circulating, and also there's a very good material circulating, to be honest. But how do you ensure that there is quality control, and then that narrative that you want to produce is not only produced but also circulated? Um, So, how do you deal with trolls, terrorists, influencers, and how they influence news agendas? It's important to consider also the clickbait nonsense that the more sort of explicit a situation is, whether it's violence or sex or bad behavior, the more people would click, so there's a commercial logic, and that is quite worrying. Um, and more recently with AI and this whole machine learning and data-driven journalism, quite big in this part of the world actually, where I'm now. They are quite serious about data, and and it's kind of journalism in my view which has no soul. So how do you talk about slightly more sophisticated issues when everything is driven by algorithms and data? Um, so we used to have whole academic debates about presence of cameras, CNN effect, so-called, how it is affecting policy. Then you had Al Jazeera effect, because Al Jazeera was showing pictures of footage that CNN wouldn't show. And then you had YouTube effect. And in of course, in YouTube there is huge potential, but YouTube is owned by Google, so they have the capacity to stop something, and they do if they find it is not suitable. So India has to have its own YouTube, and then there will be an effect eventually. Um, and again, the kind of virality, the concept of virality, and how I sort of alluded to that earlier, is commercial implications, because increasingly, people are just think of the accident or attack. It depends on who you talk to in Nandigram, and the virality associated with that. So and the commercial implications of that. So one has to kind of think about that, how that affects on how narratives are created. Um, Finally, and this is, I don't know how many young people are in the audience, but this is for really addressed to the young people, in the sense that despite what you read or watch about India in international media, which more often than not is negative or barely tolerable, um, there is a lot happening which is not on the media gaze, and I think India is on a really, in my humble opinion, very important trajectory, and especially because of its youth. Um, there are enough, enough material available to suggest something significant is happening. Um, for example, this so-called return of Asia. Um, Already, people perhaps don't remember it as often as they should. Before COVID hit us, India was the fifth largest economy in the world in terms of GDP, not purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity was third, has been third for many years now, for half a decade. But before last year, sorry, 2019, it overtook Britain as the fifth largest economy in the world. And of course, COVID brought us back quite badly. But I'm absolutely convinced it's a matter of time before it bounces back, and it's bouncing back. And then if you look at this chart, this is GDP forecast, purchasing power parity. We talk about the end of this decade. Now, the latest from Western think tanks is that now China will achieve that in 2028. So there are 2 more years gone. So, and then this very interesting book by Parag Khanna, who is based in Singapore. It's written interesting stuff about Asia. This idea that it's the future is Asian, and having being in this part of the world, you actually see it. You see that energy. You see what is happening and the scale and the ambition. And that gives me, of course, there are tensions because we have problems with our neighbor um, to the east. Of course, west we have longer problem, but that doesn't matter so much. The east one does matter. So I do feel that there is a kind of a kind of qualitative shift in the making. The Americans called it pivot, whatever. I do think that India will emerge as a very important player in that, and if it is, it's already China is emerged. We are emerging. But once we get to that stage, then we need to have a narrative which would be putting our case across. And unlike China, it doesn't have to be a propaganda outfit. We have a tradition of disagreeing, which is perfectly fine. And but our voice has to be there. It cannot be just reaction to what somebody is saying about us. We need to have our own discourse, and I think um, that's something which I would hope younger people, particularly given the technical expertise that exists today and the connectivity that digitalization has enabled, and all this thing I mentioned about Geo and all this Digital India project, is massive, massive potential. On that note, I'll stop, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention. So I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Professor Thussu, I have a question.
Yes, please. Yes.
One thing you emphasize that, and which is very obvious fact that entire news scenario at the global level is dominated by the Anglo-American, and there is no, we are not in a good position as Indian media I am talking about. So, what will be your suggestions for the government of India to ensure to make a strong presence of Indian media at global level? How can we achieve that level?
You see, I mean, had I got a clear answer, I would not be sitting in Hong Kong. I'd probably be in Delhi, and probably somebody will take me a little more seriously in the government. But I don't have those contacts. But I have to say, there are lots of ways you could do it. Um, you don't want, so for example, why is Doordarshan run by bureaucrats? Why can't it have professional people? Has India got any dearth of talented people? It's probably the largest number of highly talented journalists anywhere in the world. English-speaking journalists, multilingual journalists, globally traveled journalists. And I was in Westminster for many years, and we used to run these Chevening scholarships. So we used to get journalists, like middle career journalists, to come to London for 3 months, paid by the UK government, and we used to host them at University of Westminster. And they're from different types of media, some digital journalists, television, radio, newspapers, regional etc. And you see that Indian journalists are pretty good. So, why aren't they working for the state government, state television? Why isn't the state television, I mean, Cable G would know, people of his generation would know. There are so many reports that have been written about how should you revitalize, the national broadcaster. We've just let it just slip, and it's now, it's a tragedy because we had this amazing infrastructure set in place so that television reached across the country. Um, and we have now then given this to the kind of debates I mentioned in my presentation, which are, just think of what's going to happen to our new generation. What kind of language will they speak? What kind of perspective they will have about, forget about the world, about their own country. In a country where still, a lot of people, just it's very important to remember how we have moved from large proportion of Indian population moved from illiteracy to a visual culture of the WhatsApp variety. So they've skipped the literary bit. They haven't gone through literacy experience. So I do think, so so what that's the first thing to say, revitalize that, get it professionalized, get decent people, pay them decent salaries, train them, right? the examples I shared with you, just look at TRT, for example, which is relatively recent, the Turkish one. And it's pretty decent, of course, from a Turkish perspective, but the production quality is internationally comparable. Even the Chinese are doing that now, right? So that's the first thing to say. And the second thing I would say, because television news or news media generally does not make money, right? So state has to say, okay, we will subsidize in some shape or form. CNN wouldn't be CNN if it was not part of a major um, conglomerate which subsidizes news. You don't make money in news, right? BBC will stop operation if the British government said, okay, we are not going to give you any money. Right? But they also do other things. They do creative stuff. They make science programs. They make educational television, and they sell those projects all over the world. Now, when did Doordarshan produce anything which was sold to anybody? Because that thinking isn't there. Or even private companies. I mean, we Indians go abroad, they do fantastically well. Right? What is it that doesn't allow them to prosper intellectually, creatively in India? So I would say, as I sort of alluded to in my lecture, there has to be a kind of convergence in within the private geo, for example. Reliance is very well resourced. They can buy the best talent in the world. Niyat honi chahiye na. The intent has to be there, right? That's fundamental. And then think of diaspora. Every major city in the world, you would have an Indian person, and she would be interested in associating with some such project. And these days, with technology, is actually relatively cheap and easy to do. Now, how many efforts have been made by a corporation or a government to say, okay, this guy is in Hong Kong, he's okay, let's talk to him. Or this guy is in Chicago, let's talk to her. Or this person is in Heidelberg, let's talk to him or her. Zilch, nothing. And then we complain, with these Chinese guys, they're doing this, and the Turks are doing this, and the Iranians are doing this. So I think there has to be some kind of a group of people who actually think about it and say, okay, what should be the process? What should be the, you know, and so the Chinese started the international channel in English in 2000, which is 21 years ago, 20 years ago. And even today, after putting like billions of dollars into it, nobody watches it. I mean, people like me watch because I study these things, but most people don't watch it. They have in German, they have in French, they have in Arabic, they have in Russian, they have in special channel for Africa, they have channel for America. But they have a long agenda. It doesn't matter. This is our view. We will put out there. People will think this is sarkari propaganda. Fine. We don't have to do that. We could actually be more clever and say, okay, this is a company which is run by X trust or something, and it does in a more sophisticated, not crude. I showed you some examples how crudely we do things. And the assumption is that this will work. It doesn't. The world is far more sophisticated today, in terms of communication world is far too sophisticated. So we got to have a different set of people. Not your average IAS. I mean, Modi said that in Parliament the other week. You need a wider range of talent to say, okay, they're different. So get somebody from corporate world, get somebody from, think of how many Indian journalists work in international media, top level. And I'm sure some of them would say, okay, I've got something to do for my own country, I might do it. So there has to be kind of big project really, and that takes, a lot of thinking.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Myself, Randhir Kumar Gautam. I am from Raffles University, Neemrana. So I teach sociology, and I have interest of journalism as well. So we can see media anchor who is more ideological than profession. So in order to have, I think, a publicly accountable political democracy, it is a vital important to have a democratic media. So how can we have a democratic media Is free media is a democratic media? Because I think we should forget about the notion of free media itself, because this is a myth. Because if you see, you know, every news anchor, every journalist, every producer has their own biases, their own ideologies, and even with the best will in the world to have a journalist integrity. So, can you, how can you, tell the solution of this very existential problem, right? Where is accountability? Even you can see, as you have mentioned, Doordarshan has a bureaucratic apparatus to run, for the sake of government propaganda and all these things. And with the advent of this privatization, we can see the glorification of post-truth agenda for that matter. So, what is the solution of this existential crisis?
This is thank you. It's a really interesting question. This is the problem not just in India. This is global problem today because future of journalism is, as a profession, is in great, trouble because it's things are moving to a very different kind of journalism. I mentioned the data-driven stuff, so a lot of that um, I mean, you may remember last Olympics, when was it, in Rio a few years ago, for the first time, AP, Associated Press, was using a machine to write the sports stories. So it's very difficult to act. It's an existential crisis, really. But what I was thinking, and not just in terms of journalism, I was thinking much in a kind of, this could be a portal of some sort. It could be a space for, but in a professional way. So you have a forum or a web-based presence which is professional and which reaches, which is especially, my focus of the talk is really international. I'm not talking about domestic so much. I mean, I refer to it, of course, because you have to, but my focus is in the international space. How do you put the Indian narrative there? And Indian narrative is not just about whether Mr. Modi is winning or losing. That's temporary. That another maybe another term, then someone else will be in power, or maybe two terms, maybe three terms. But there's a bigger narrative. There's a narrative about India as a civilizational power. That there are ideas which have not been recognized outside India. The other day, I was having a conversation with a very well-educated German colleague, and she was talking about numbers, and she said it's all Arabic. I said, no, actually, it came from India. So how do you know? I said, no, I do know. I had a master's in history, and every Indian knows this. So they don't know, because how would they know? They have not been told. Or you ask an average educated person, have they heard of, Takshashila or Nalanda? They haven't. Where would they know? Why would they know? So should that not be an agenda for us to say, okay, no, we had universities, centuries before there were any universities in Europe. And these are, we're not talking mythology, we're talking about historical facts, right? So it's not just about, I'm saying, just I was using the word narrative, discourse quite frequently in my presentation. So, you have to tell that story, and for that story, India needs a lot of introspection. Apart from the kind of existential problems and the nature of journalism, and the kind of personality of um, the host or whatever. These are, in my view, relatively unimportant things. The bigger agenda is what you need to discuss, and I don't think there has been much discussion on that. Um, as far as I know, I mean, I'm not. But friends tell me that people who are in the more influential positions tell me that it's not a priority area. Um, IT cell is because that translates into more immediate gains. So this bigger vision, which actually requires a lot more sophisticated thinking, is often not. Maybe it's happening behind the scenes. I don't know. It's not in the public domain.
Thank you, Professor Thussu. I'm Anuradha Bhattacharya. We've met in London.
Yes,
Um,
of course. I was going to say hello. Thank you. How are you? And
I'm
where are
very well,
you?
sir.
Where are you now?
Sir, I've just finished a project with ICSSR and I'm just working towards publishing it.
Are you in
Uh,
India at the moment?
Sir, I
Okay.
am.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, as you're aware, I've been working on the area of media ownership concentration under the blessings of Professor Eli Noam. So, you just spoke very warmly about Geo and the strides it's making in the digital sphere. I was just wondering if you'd like to comment that Geo belongs to Reliance and who in turn already own a large number of television stations, network, directly and indirectly, as also for news, newspapers, and most of all, they control the advertising and the track record, the ethical track record of Reliance has been patchy, you know, and maybe one could use a stronger word for it. So, with so much of ownership of media and even news media going into it, I mean, they are then going, we are going straight into, the area of dominance, and they are more likely to promote news, which will bolster their business interests. I mean, there is a track record of them having done so. Rather than news, the way we one would traditionally understand news as being to inform, to educate, and also to entertain. Now, of course, the entertainment part, it's all going to infotainment. But given that tremendous linkage with big business, with news, it's actually, whatever we studied at LSE economic growth, I mean, it's actually contraindicative. But you're promoting that Geo will give us a, a platform. Would you care to elaborate, please?
No, thank you. That's a very important question because media concentration and its implications to plurality, whether it's ownership or ideas and thoughts, and it's very very important. Um, but given I mentioned it specifically, I'm aware that they are also very, very important in, I think I alluded to that in my talk, in television space. I mean, TV 18, so it's got so many regional channels, it's very, very powerful. And it has, I've used the word convergence, very good relations with the government, current government. Um, but if you look at other cases around the world, you will find that there is some big business involved in it, right? And I think because they have such a big business, they could actually, I mean, it's in the realm of possible without looking at a kind of short-term view of how they can use news media or geo to make money, which is what they do, actually have a bigger project about. So, for example, as you know, they are setting up a university in India, and their ambition is they'll be going to have a Harvard in India, a private university, which will be compared. I wish that happens. But that ambition is important because they have the resources and they realize that we need to up our research profile to be taken seriously internationally. That is my kind of, you know, um, view about that because you do need certain scale and scope. And I think Reliance provides that. And but at the same time, there is the danger that which is already possibly happening in the mobile space, that it might be happening with 5G, obviously, because they have invested a lot in that, that they get a kind of, monopoly on both infrastructure and then also the content which is going through that. That danger is there, but I think I also believe in a democratic setup that we have with its many loopholes. Um, there is a little more kind of space for discussion and debate, and I would have thought that a company of the Reliance's size and ambition would actually like to have an Indian voice in the international space, right? So that was what I was alluding to, that if it is just a government of India output out there in the world, it will be seen, understandably, as a propaganda outfit. But if it is a more complicated, partnership, then perhaps it will be more effective. I meant in that respect. But I totally agree with your concern about the danger of excessive centralization of power, and then that can be manifested in terms of its misuse for political purposes, etc., etc. And there have been cases around the world. Murdoch is a good example of that. So, yeah, I mean, I fully understand that. I understand, and I
There's
share
also
your.
the Italian, as
Of
also the
course,
Italian case, right?
Berlusconi. I mean, he
Not
became
Berlusconi, yeah.
prime minister not once or twice, but three times, right? In a sophisticated Western democracy, very politicized people in Italy. They had like 50 governments in Second World War, and he becomes prime minister three times. How did he do that? He owned football clubs and he owned, television channels, and then he had some parties also. We won't go there. That's not polite. But anyway, so any other questions or comments?
Daya,
Good afternoon.
yeah.
Sorry, I can't see. Who is asking? I can't see. Keval, आप पूछें?
Yeah. I just a
Please.
very quick question. So others will have time to ask questions. Quick
Ji.
question about there is just to point out to you there is Beyond, a new channel, which is
Yes,
supported by Z.
I know.
Though it sounds like a government propaganda channel, and so it has no real credibility. But my question is regarding recent development with regard to the two platforms which really dominate news. It's not so much the news agencies and others which dominate, but the two platforms, Google and Facebook. And now they have agreed to pay some of the news publishers some token amount so that
Yes.
they can sustain their businesses. Do you think this development will change the global news scenario in any way?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. Really important. But just before that, can I just respond to a Vion thing, which is, I'm amazed that somebody with the heft of a Z network would come up with that title for a news network.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
astonishing. They study, PR and advertising at university. They told us it should be catchy. Vion kya hota hai, bhai? What does Vion mean? Of all the words, they're like that, hundreds and thousands of words you could pick for a news organization. But I have to say, it's so you and I know it, but ask an average person on the streets of New York or Hong Kong or London, they have never heard of it. Right? So that's exactly my point about, it has to be in a level of, as I was saying about Chinese, they've been doing for 20 years, and only now some people say, oh, this is a kind of, there's some channel available there. So it takes time. But to your question about Google and Facebook and the Australian example where they said, okay, we'll pay you some money, the newspaper, that's a very important change, because that at the moment what happens is the newspapers are and media, not just newspapers, not other media outlets, are losing money because a lot of content is for free and it's all through web. That's why you need your own platforms. You see, just imagine that there was something in India which is Indian platform, and then they can have a deal with the Indian news organizations, and they could benefit, because this is at the moment what is happening is that unless you are a Wall Street Journal or you are a New York Times or you're Economist, which has a certain kind of, you know, credibility, heft, whatever you want to call it, it's very hard to make money on digital platforms, right? So I think if there was that's why I mentioned this idea of Atmanirbhar Digital India, because that's what is needed. Have Indian platforms, and then there could be some arrangement via the state authorities or through professional organizations to share the kind of revenue that these platforms are making out of media companies, so that there is a space for healthy journalism, which is sustainable, and also in the in the public interest, because not everything can be market led in any system. Even in the most commercial countries in the world, in the US, for example, there are lots of alternative, channels, and that's why it makes it more interesting place if everything was, so there is this idea of public journalism, and I think in India that's very well entrenched, and I think this would be a good, but it'll take time because to set up the platforms will. So we got to work around what we got today with us, which is to kind of, again, Geo would be interesting because they have links both with Facebook and Google, and they could exert some influence on some kind of arrangement with Indian media organizations, so they get a little more money for using, for their content being used by the platforms.
Thank you, Daya.
Thanks.
Hello, Daya. Can you hear me?
Of course, Geetaji, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm
I
fine.
can't
I'm
see you,
fine.
I can hear you. Yes, good to
Sorry?
see. Good to speak. Good to speak. Yes, please
Yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead.
Okay. Well, I thought you covered a very wide range of issues, though your emphasis was more on how India should be both facing the diatribe against its own policies, which are national or internal, and how they are seen worldwide by very certain entities which have a certain bias towards India for whatever reasons. But I think you were also trying to allude to the fact that internally or domestically, we should also be looking at a media policy. Since we don't have a policy, the urge to do things in a knee-jerk reaction comes very easy to us, and we think we are doing things in the right way, but we don't really get a measured response to that. So, and you also, I think, simultaneously, and you're trying to give an impression, which I think can be misread or misconstrued, which is that by default, say that if China has done exceedingly well in trying to position itself, not just in northern Western Europe, but also in Africa and other parts of the country as well. And they have used media as the gateway, because I know in South Africa and in other African countries, they have replaced India, which had a soft part through its different, media forays. And that comes very easy to India, but I think that has been kind of dispensed with. I'm alluding to Bollywood also. So I think you're also trying to suggest that India should have a policy of which will give it some kind of thrust, intent, and purpose, which would really make any strategic change in its ventures more meaningful. And also, I think media policy is a pejorative word in India, though it's not there in other parts of the world, because within that domain, you're also talking of regulation, you're talking of existence of media entities, and again, I like to put it in quotes, freedom of expression. It's it, we have played with this word in a way which is more to suit the constituencies abroad, rather than repurposing it to understand, what is our intent, and making it very transparent but also meaningful. So I think we are caught between, kind of a trap where we want to look good, but I think internally it's actually damaging us. And because we are caught within this whole idea of looking very good to the Western audience, and without understanding that there's nothing which comes free in terms of free press.
Yeah. I,
There
I,
are
I,
strings
I,
attached.
sorry, I think you raised some very important points, especially about policy. And um, the suggestion by some scholars is that not having a policy is the policy, or not having a clear policy is the policy. And and when there is a kind of decisive policy like they recently about digital, regulation, etc., there was, if you look at the response both within India and internationally, it's been very negative, because we are, or with Coup, this Twitter version of India, Indian platform, which was just, has got not been that successful, but it was launched. And I remember reading some pieces in Western press, which were saying that this is going to be a platform for a certain kind of ideology. So I think there is, I mean, in the policy realm, there is a huge amount of work to do. And as you said, it's not just pejorative terms. It's just it's not taken care of seriously. I can't think of many places, with the possible exception of Jamia, where people are, working on it. There isn't much research coming out of India on media policy when there are so many aspects of that policy that need deep analysis. So I think as academics, we also have to kind of take a share of that, blame, in the sense that we haven't really encouraged our researchers to think about policy, and not just in the Indian context, but a global context. Because as you mentioned about film, for example, popular cinema, we have ceded spaces to others. Turkish television is very popular in Middle East, where Bollywood used to be big, because there hasn't been any concerted effort to promote it. I mean, as you probably know, I wrote a book about soft power of India many years, like 2013 it was published. And it was, the title was, communicating India's soft power Buddha to Bollywood. So I had a whole chapter about how
Yeah,
important
I
Bollywood.
remember. I remember. I mean, that's why I mentioned Bollywood because I
Yeah.
knew you had that angle.
It is also the case with Buddhism. I mean, that's been appropriated by the Chinese, right? Just think of it. How interesting. For last 6 years, there is a government which claims to be, got to revive Sanatan Dharam. We got to do all right. We should do that, absolutely. It is a shame for us as educated Indians that Vivek Dev Roy, who is the, as you know, the Prime
Yeah,
Minister Economic
yeah.
Advisory Board. He's the chair of it. He's published recently, unabridged translation of Mahabharata. Now, last time somebody did that was another Bengali, was in 1890s. So हमने 70 साल में यार एक भी हमने ट्रांसलेशन नहीं किया. So something is wrong with our intellectual tradition when we think this is not important. And now you have an economist doing that translation in English, and Penguin publishes it, and it is visible around the world. So where is that kind of scholarship? Why is it not being promoted? And I think so. We talk a lot. I said earlier, but we don't do enough. So if it's a question of media, policy or international media policy, there has to be then discussion. Think tanks, universities, bureaucrats, corporations. Let's get together and say, okay, this is what we should do. And people at certain stage in their lives actually are not after jobs or promotion. They've arrived. They need to contribute to a bigger discourse, right? The whole kind of vision thing. But if we are only talking amongst bureaucrats of certain dispensation and certain thinking, the discourse wouldn't move to the next level. So it becomes bogged down in bureaucratic speak, and it is so boringly stupid that, I'm sorry, my language, but it really is not to be taken seriously by anybody. And
I think
when
it resonates with many people what you said. So I'm sure that it makes more sense, but I think it requires fearless objectivity to say these things upfront, and that's when things will move. But I think we are so caught up in our own world to think in a very constricted way that the way innovative ways of thinking, doing things are totally absent from our own horizon in terms of mental horizon, or even among the community of people who are concerned but are not able to get together to do things in a more forward-looking way.
but also I think the bigger problem is there's an emphasis on difference, whether it's religious, it's language, it's gender, it's class, it's caste. There's a whole industry around emphasizing difference, because that's kind of very postmodern way of thinking about the world. And in the process, we miss the bigger picture, that there is actually a lot of work that we need to do for the next generation, especially in our field, which is hugely underdeveloped, both intellectually and in research terms. And I think we have, a lot of work to do. And I think these kind of conversations are very, very important. And I wish it was done at a, national level, in the sense that, people from other other stakeholders were involved. So you get a sense of, that um, there is a need to converge these different, interests and intellectuals and corporates and, think tanks and government, because the task that one is kind of talking about is a long-term project. It can't happen, next year. Think of the farmers thing. I mean, this is so sad, because in a country where millions of people do not get enough to eat, where millions of tons of food is wasted, right? वो कब तक चलेगा भाई? How long will we have the same village where there's the same nexus of certain people who make money, and and other farmers live in a tremendously difficult situation? When will we modernize it? When will we get those things in place so the food doesn't get rotten or eaten by rats? It's actually consumed by our own people or exported. So if you remember, there were videos circulating in social media. Madam, Sushma Swaraj was saying in Parliament that exactly the kind of thing that the opposition is saying today. It's 10 years ago. So we lost a decade. And that's true of media policy. We could have had this discussion in 1990s when satellite TV came. There was no discussion. It was just allowed to go, okay, you know somebody, you know someone else, you get a license, you put something up. And so, I mean, there are lots of issues. And it's not particularly an India problem, actually. It's a much wider problem. But I think we are in many ways in a very good situation to actually deal with it, because we can, we have spaces for conversation. We have still a lot of people forget it, how I mean, I've lived in China, so I can tell you from personal experience how limited the narrative here is in terms of, I was in a meeting the other day, and a China conference, and they said, "Oh, you should be." They tested. They said, "What is in your background?" There's no free Hong Kong poster or something like that, right? So thankfully, that doesn't happen in India. But anyway, so
Thank you.
I'll,
Thank you so much. Thank you,
great to
Daya.
great to speak to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi.
Hello, sir. I am not I am not from the media or journalism field, but I teach Chinese and I'm researching on China's soft power. I have your book also on India's soft power. My small question is, sir, and thanks for the informative and insightful talk. My question is how to draw a line between propagation and promotion and propaganda, especially in terms of Chinese propagation of Chinese narrative, and what Western countries or Western researchers term it as propagation and propaganda. China says that it's their just promotion of their narrative. So what's your take on this?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I have in a previous publication, I made a distinction between propaganda and persuasion. So I use the word
Okay.
persuasion. So capitalists do
Mhm.
persuasion, the authoritarian governments do propaganda. So propaganda is associated with, Soviet Union, China, Iran, etc., etc. And in China, as you would know if you're studying China, propaganda is not a negative word. Actually, it is perfectly, positive word to use. And in fact, if you go back a little bit in history, well, the origins of the word propaganda, which goes back to Catholicism and expansion of propagating those ideas, basically, converting people to Christianity. More recently, in political science in the 1920s, in the US, for example, propaganda was a perfectly legitimate and positive thing to think about. It was only after the war, Second World War, Hitler and all that, and communism, that propaganda got a negative connotation in the West. So what the Chinese do is pure and simple propaganda. They don't actually, hide that fact. As I said, propaganda is a positive thing for them. In Chinese universities, you have in the university departments, there are people who work for the party, and they say, well, I'm doing this because it's going me to get to the next level of my career. So it's institutionalized,
Mhm.
and it is seen as such by outside, audiences or people, because it's nearly in many ways quite crude propaganda. Despite having put in a lot of effort and money towards it, it's not been very effective. Um, Much more effective has been actually the more recent, platform. Think of TikTok, for instance. It's been extremely popular because it attracts a different demographics, and it's like short videos, a generation which actually likes that kind of content. And a lot of people do not know until recently that it was actually a Chinese company. Um, so they've been more successful in that space, in digital space, and that's why I mentioned how they managed it, how they actually created an ecosystem, a digital ecosystem, and they invested a lot of money in it. They got their diaspora people to come back, paid them huge amount of resources, set up new universities, and there's amazing stuff they've done. And we've got a lot to catch up, because we keep a question: why have we not produced a mobile phone? यार 1 billion लोग रहते हैं भारत में. 1 billion, 1.3 billion actually. Let's say 1 billion will buy it, even if they pay $1. Let's say $1 billion. हम फोन क्यों नहीं बना? सोचने वाली बात है. Something has to be, there's something wrong, and we got to address it. अब कितना वो मतलब how long will you make things for big companies? चीनियों ने वही किया. They did that for 20 years, and then they learned. It's okay. अब बना लिया ना, अब हम 5G बनाएंगे, तो दुनिया हमसे खरीदेगी. And that's exactly what they've done. So we have to see what we can learn. And in digital domain, they've done exceptionally well. That's why Americans are so concerned, and Indians, we should be concerned, because our data is. Hi, Shweta. Good to see you.
Sir, good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Sir, all good. Thank you so much. I've been listening to you, and I had some queries as I was kind of going through your session. So some of them have been answered by now. So initially I had more questions, but maybe I thought I'll just ask one question that has been troubling me for some time. So I had kind of a study wherein I had explored television news coverage of Arab conflict, Arab Spring, in the sense Libya and Egypt. So there I realized that there was very little coverage. I was exploring private television news channels since I did not have access.
In India, you mean in India? Coverage in India?
Coverage by Indian television news channels,
okay.
NDTV and CNN IBN. So I realized that, as you have mentioned also, that there has been a decline in foreign news. So, and it has been there for quite some time. It is only getting worse. So has television now lost that kind of influence to create that narrative that probably emerged in the 90s when we saw that satellite growth in Asia and India particularly? And does audio-visual narrative of news in that sense is at a loss because we really do not have the infrastructure to kind of create that kind of influential narrative? So is television redundant now, especially from academic perspective when it comes to international news? And has digital in that sense emerged influential enough to create a powerful narrative, which is India-centric in that sense?
So thank you. Very interesting question. Thank you. But you see, it's not just the television news, which is actually pretty bad in terms of international coverage, but even newspapers have less foreign coverage than used to be the case when I was studying in Delhi many years ago. And it's interesting because it's a kind of contradiction. At one level, India is opening up, it's got a big diaspora, businesses, a lot of international interaction. But our window on the world is actually becoming smaller. The media window is becoming smaller. There's a lot of celebrity stuff. There's all that nonsense, but serious news on television on foreign affairs is almost negligible. It's confined to certain parts, UK, US, maybe Pakistan, maybe China. But if you ask, an average Indian, Syria mein kya ho raha hai, so they have no idea. If you ask them what is our
Absolutely.
policy on, internet governance, there is no discussion because it's not in the public domain. So how do you get that into a more like popular level of journalism is a popular kind of communication process. So I do think that it's all going to move to digital anyway. It's already happening. I mean, I watch a lot of news, Indian news, but that's I'm watching on YouTube. I'm not watching it on television, right? Because and you can watch it on mobile or your whatever digital device you have today. So that's why I was emphasizing the last part of my talk about the importance of the digital, and that's why I also mentioned specifically big organizations like Geo, because I think that is what you need. You need a kind of convergence, and then you create a little platform which is not the state, you know, not Doordarshan, because that will be immediately branded as Sarkari propaganda. But you need something, India should be able to produce something more sophisticated than that. I mean, look at Al Jazeera as an interesting case in point, because it's what they did was basically they hired BBC people, and it's like BBC has suddenly gone global. It's really the whole approach is BBC, but because it's Al Jazeera, that gives them a little more space to cover the world in a way that BBC doesn't, and it has become a generally very successful tool for Qatar's foreign policy goals, right? And it's very good on its website is excellent, and of course they put resources towards it. So India could think on those terms, because that's they don't need a television channel. They could have a platform which is a public-private kind of thing, and even very small operation. For example, the wire, which is recent and small and not particularly the government is not really happy with it, but it has now 10 million people, viewers, people who read its stuff, which is quite a lot. So it's a relatively small outfit, but if you think of that like 50 times bigger, the diaspora itself is 330 million people, and a lot of them are professionals all over the world. So there is actually infrastructure in place. It's just a question of connecting the dots. So I do think it is, it will improve, and as India becomes more important, then foreign affairs will become more important. Look at China. China was totally cut off from the world. But if you're investing in 100 countries, then you need to find out what's happening in those countries. So it's a matter of time. I really, in the long term, I don't think it's going to be a problem. But we need to have this conversation now. So in the next 10 years, you develop something which is actually global and credible and professional. In a language which we actually have the advantage. Or which other country in the world would have so many people who are conversant in a language which, like it or loathe it, is the language of global communication? you know so if we had any sense, 20 years ago we should have been teaching Chinese English language and made billions of dollars. I'm serious. But there's no plan. There's no discussion. Okay, we have the English, these guys are desperate to learn English, let us send our kids there and they will learn. Anyway, so I'll shut up.
Allow me to come in again, sir, so at the
Ji.
cost of maybe somebody else. I'm so sorry, but I was just wondering, sir, that NDTV has a fair recognition globally, because we were at the Times Warner Center and they were talking about having acquired a Times NDTV lifestyle network, etc. So NDTV, would you care to comment what has gone wrong? I mean, what exactly went wrong? Because NDTV was doing a fairly good job till recently of promoting the Indian voice, and it was heard. It was not just that they were promoting it, they
Yeah.
were also being heard. But what do you think went wrong, as per you?
I don't know the inside story, but I do know that they have. I mean, for a start, there's a lot more competition in India itself now, and some of their best journalists have moved to other channels. So it's the output is not. I mean, I watch it frequently. The output is not as good as it it used to be. It was noticed in the West. That's why I mentioned it in one of my slides, because it was the first. It was actually, you could give that credit to Dr. Roy. He is a pioneering journalist for television, and he created a certain kind of news narrative which was not state controlled, which was actually more professional than what was available on Doordarshan. So that's why it got noticed outside India. But then you need much more than that, because it's a very expensive medium. You need many more resources, and they haven't been able to garner that, and that's why they have. And then, as I said, if you're against Reliance or Z, these are big companies with a lot more resources. So they had domestic problem as well as internationally. They couldn't really sustain that. Also, I think politically they have. It's like Wire has a kind of agenda that they have to be anti-regime, current regime, and they cannot see anything good in what this government is doing, which again I think is very un-Indian, because it's never black and white, right? So if your prime minister is has built 200 million toilets for the people, poorest people in the country, that deserves commendation. If we could produce a vaccine in less than a year, how many countries in the world are producing vaccines? You can count them in one hand. So it's not a small achievement, and we never do that because we don't celebrate it in our own country. We say, well, okay, is that safe? Can we do this? Is Indian? Is not going. वो जब तक वो ब्रिटेन में नहीं छपेगा लैंसेट में, we won't take it seriously. अपना बनाओ, have a journal which is internationally respected, so it's published in Indian journal, so this is credible. This is what we need to do, and it's NDTV is great, but it's a very small player in the bigger scheme of things. You need much more than that.
If you will permit me to ask another, draw you up a little bit more on that. What would you think is the role of these television rating agencies, actually, which are the gatekeepers of advertising revenue? I think
Well,
NDTV, I think, had a problem. They created a problem for themselves when they took Nielsen to court in the US.
Of course, and we heard their saga continues with other channels. So I don't want to go into that, but the whole system is problematic, because the whole model is problematic. So that's a different discussion. Maybe different talk about the media economics. And actually, one person who's doing very interesting work in that is both Parthsarthi. He's just published some really good stuff on that media economy. He's doing excellent work. So. I'm glad to see some work is beginning to take place in that space. And we need much more work on that. So I don't really know the complexities of this, but I'm aware of the debates. And as I said, the system is basically flawed and it needs sorting out.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, I am Aman Kumar Singh, student of MA in Mass Communication in Central University of Jharkhand.
Great.
Sir, my question is, sir, as you told that we should propagate and popularize our historical culture, heritage, monuments, etc., to reach across the globe, or to aware the world about India, that how much we are civilized and what are our historical background. Sir, do you think that taking initiative by every individual would influence the popularity and participation of Indian news platforms if we simply collect information from Indians across the globe, no matter whatever their profession are? For example, sir, today our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi started an initiative to popularize a historical movement of Dandi Yatra, which is participated by 81 volunteers. So using every Indians as participants of media could provide realistic and simplistic reporting, could set a new dimension to Indian media, sir. Sir, your opinion, please, sir.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, and it would be wonderful if this could be coordinated and professionalized in a sense, because when you're talking to an international audience, remember India is not a priority area for important countries, because India is not a threat. China is a threat. So West is interested in China. We are not a threat. We might be market. We might be, so we have to create a space where we are able to tell the world about, and I don't mean just about our great history, and I mean that's all there, but there are also lots of very, very serious problems, and we want to address them. And if we can manage what China has in terms of eliminating extreme poverty in a democratic setup, that would be phenomenal, you know, because China has done it in a one party state. They don't have to, they can just do anything they want, the state, the government. So, Kevin, can you mute? Because we can hear your phone. Mute a little bit. Thank you. So, it's what I'm sort of, talking about is something more
China.
more professionally
Yeah, yeah.
organized, with a very clear agenda that we are talking about India to. My whole focus of talk was global, where is India and where it should be and how that can be done. So I think what you're suggesting is very interesting, but it'll take more time to coordinate and organize. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for asking the question.
So good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Neeru from CMS department. So as time is not allowing us to take more queries, so I am just reading one more query from Habibu Nisha actually. So Thussu sir, she is asking, what's your comment on international views on Indian media?
International views on Indian media.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, so um, well, it's so think of when you say international media, what do you mean? Are we talking about Japan? Are we talking about South Korea?
Habibu
Basically,
Nisha, are you?
let me finish. I think what she basically means is international English language media, means UK and US, right? Because that's what we identify English with. Because if you look at
My
uh,
question is that how Indian media is rated globally? That's the question I think. So,
Sir,
how
actually,
Indian
there are
media is
two
rated globally?
questions. Yeah.
Neeru,
Yes, sir. Yes.
so how Indian media is
Neeru, go
viewed
ahead.
internationally, is that the question?
Globally.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. That is the question, I am, and Mirza. Yeah, that is exactly the question that I
is she
understand.
present?
Yeah.
Okay, so how is Indian media viewed internationally? So my response to that question was what I said before. What international media we are talking about? We are essentially talking about America and US. And why should they take us seriously? They don't, because what they publish about us, 9 out of 10 are stories which highlight a negative aspect of India. And by the way, this is not an India specific problem. It's also a problem of any non-Western country. So think of what gets Iran, what stories get from Iran in the international media, what gets published about Russia, what gets published about China, what gets published about Africa broadly. So it's a much bigger problem because we only make news when there is something which is like farmers protest that gets international coverage. And in terms of ranking us, in terms of, look, we've seen most recently the Freedom House report, which is put us further down in democracy index, and there's a new report from a think tank in Sweden, and that's say, okay, we are not a democracy. The problem is that we take these things too seriously. We should not really worry about what they think of us, right? We should say, okay, well, we are okay. We should do. We have lots of improvement needed in our lots of areas, and we should focus on that. What the white man thinks of art is, that's like colonial mentality. You should get over that, because they will never think highly of you. They will always have a sense of superiority. So, even if some of the finest journalists that I know who work in Western media organization, Indian journalists, are fantastic journalists, but they would still be seen as, okay, this person is, is Indian, or he's, whatever. So there is a problem, and that's a structural problem, and we should be a little skinned about it. So basically, what I was saying is that we need to have our own narrative, which will also then help us to counter the negative responses that we often receive. And again, as I say, it's not just an India-specific problem; it's a problem for much of the world. And I would argue, by and large, we are better than many other countries in that space, because we are not a threat. We are not we're not a problem country for US. We are supposed to be an ally, right? Okay. Any other?
Any other queries? Any other questions from anyone?
I can see Charu there. Hello, Charu. How are you?
Good evening.
We can conclude now.
Sorry, my mic was off. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Good to see you. Well, hear you. Okay, so I think I have actually I finished my time slot, but I'm quite happy to take any. Is there any like?
Yes, sir.
Pressing
Thank you
question?
very much, sir. Actually, I'm going to invite one of my colleagues, Dr. Anup Kumar, for vote of thanks. So, Dr. Anup,
Thank
it's
you.
over to you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much. It's my privilege to propose vote of thanks for Professor Daya Thussu, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation. On behalf of the Department of Culture and Media Studies, Central University of Rajasthan, I extend my sincere thanks to sir for your valuable, informative, and interactive session on India in the global news sphere. Thank you, sir, for sharing your valuable knowledge on this particular subject with us. And thanks to the students from our department, from other institutions for joining the session. And thanks to all respected faculties from all over India for joining the session and encouraging us. Thank you all. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a great privilege to also see lots of old friends. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. Bye-bye.